love that. Staring at me. No, it's beautiful.
So, shall we start? Yes, that would be perfect.
Two bags of kazoo.
Wait, is it either or?
Yeah, I was one, you're helping pass me.
Oh, okay.
You can choose whatever you want. I can tell you, like, you clearly need to run the police.
We are distributing musical instruments.
It's the guy you made me choose.
We are distributing musical instruments. You can be percussion, you can be melody, you can be whatever you want.
Thank you. And then
Oh wait, I want to leave it going for me.
Go ahead, I'll take one off here. There you go. Thank you for making that look seamless.
We have kazoos, we have penny whistles, and drumsticks, and drums, and cowbells. All right, let's start up. Welcome. Welcome. This is the session on teaching as improvisation, inviting the unexpected, the theory of teaching as improvisation. Welcome, everyone. I'm Scherr. I teach at the University of Georgia Law School. Inviting the unexpected. So, Karen, you want to talk about yourself?
Karen Kaas, Quinnipiac School of Law. I'm the Director of Experiential Education. I'm teaching externships for 10 years. Before that, I was exclusively in-house and some other simulation courses on the side.
I'm Russell Gabriel. I work here at the University of Georgia. I do a criminal defense externship.
All right.
Not the more.
You have to be yourself. You have to be
I
yourself.
try to keep my clients from having to march.
There we go. So what we'd like to do is just get started. We're about to work our way as usual. There's a roadmap. What we want to do, we'll start with some improv exercises, thus the musical instruments that you all should have by now. We'll turn to talk about a conceptual framework for considering teaching as improvisation. There'll be a small quick write after that. We'll have a class demonstration that will require, where we'll benefit from participation from all of y'all. And we'll close out with some takeaways. So that's where we're headed. And I just want to notice that there's also a meta roadmap here. We are setting up this session to have a structure for working our way through that will include room for improvisation by you and by us. One of the themes of the session will be the interaction between structure and improvisation. But we're going to start with exercise. You want to set this up?
Do you all have instruments of some kind? If anybody doesn't, is there anybody who needs something else? You can use your hands, and if you just need to beat on the tail on the desk, you can. Do part of the rhythm section. Some of you have kazoos. We're not anticipating the London Philharmonic. And we're just going to ask that you throw in whatever you feel like, whatever you can. Alex is going to start off with a melody on the penny whistle. I'm going to put a little rhythm to that here on this drum. If somebody else wants to come down and play the other side of the drum, you're welcome to. I know you have like this drumming thing going. I can see it. You got it. You got it. You know. So just pull your chair down and we can collaborate on that. And we're just going to do a couple minutes. This is sort of our starting warm-up exercise here.
Ready to go?
The next thing we're going to do is play a clip of some famous jazz musicians improvising. We're going to play about 4 minutes of this, and it's really the Miles Davis Quartet around 1960 without Miles Davis and John Coltrane on the saxophone playing Green Dolphin Street. And then, and I just wanted to say, you can listen to this however you wish. You just had lunch. If you want to watch, because this is a video online. If you want to close your eyes and listen to it, that's fine. We have 4 minutes of this. Enjoy.
questions about what we just did, both the music that you created, the sound that you created, and what you just heard. So shall I go through the questions?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, how did you react to the different types of improv that you heard? Both what we did in the class to start and what you heard the quartet doing. Were they structured or unstructured? Was there a leader?
Mr. Kaas. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's
Just
it.
throwing them out there.
Just throwing out the questions. Those are the questions, yeah.
I was hesitant to join in. I waited for somebody else to join in for the song. Until, but I didn't, because it sounded weird, first of all.
Right. Right. You wanted to hide a little bit.
Yeah.
Other reaction.
In terms of the first question, I loved it. To be part of a group that was just everybody joining in, participating, individually having enough confidence to put ourselves out there. Like there's some structure, there's some basis to allow us to join in, to participate, and then make the whole thing better.
It's like building up what Annie said, it's having a base of knowledge that you're confident in, and then you can improvise from it. Seems to me to be, like, I wasn't sure, how this thing worked, or how it would sound, or whatever, but you hear, like, Coltrane, like, he knows everything, right? And so he can just go and, like, plow ahead, and I feel like there's an analogy there as well. Like, once you've got a base of knowledge, and you're, like, a base skill set, you feel much more comfortable improvising.
So that suggests that improv might rely a little bit on some pre-existing knowledge. And stuff.
Absolutely.
We're playing on the platform.
Yeah.
I think we were in two different universes.
We didn't sound like that video?
Maybe we did. Couldn't hear all the instruments, but his ability to keep a theme for the most part and do it in the way that he did is unbelievable. Just in terms of speed, in terms of just putting the notes together in a way that, we could all listen to this for God knows how many times. None of us could duplicate it in whatever instrument you will try to choose. But it's all based on the idea that he had the knowledge and skill, right, to play, I think, incredible music in a structured way if he wanted to, and he took it to a different level.
I think maybe there's a comment over here about the structure as well. No.
Okay, yeah, same thing, I mean, you played, like one stanza of Battle Hymn, whatever, what did you play?
When the Saints Come
When the Saints Come
Marching
Marching In, yes, okay. And he played two stanzas, and then, and as everyone said, that set the tone, and his improvisation throughout came back at every, at different points to the melody. He incorporates the melody into his improv, which allows, I think, our brains or allows our ear to stay with him. Sometimes when you go to a jazz club and people start improvising, they lose you because they go so far off the reservation, you don't hear the strain of the melody. And he never does that, which is why he's.
Well, it suggests a certain discipline, right?
Yeah.
Maintaining a basic harmonic structure,
Right.
maintaining a basic series of chords, and maybe even a suggestion and hint of the same melody from moment to moment, but going off in different directions with it. Who was the leader in the John Schultz, the video? Were there
Was
leaders
there?
and followers? Is that not the right way
Is
to
there?
think about it?
Is there? What do you think about that?
Yeah.
I think it was a piano player. Sort of provided the background structure that kept it moving in a certain tempo and direction, more so than even the drums.
Is somebody else?
How about with ours?
Who was the leader and who was the follower in ours? Or, again, is that the wrong way to think about it? Were there no leaders and followers in the work that we did?
We were all anarchists.
Yeah.
There were starters and enhancers and continuers, and people kept shifting. But I don't think throughout there was a leader.
So an initiator, maybe,
Right.
right? And then people contributing from their own. Any other thoughts about any of these questions? All right.
We're
well,
about
let's-
ready to move
I
on.
think we're ready to move on. That's good. This is a good starter, and we want to use this as a way of introducing a basic conceptual framework for teaching itself as an improvisation. And so with that, I'm going to just go through a couple slides relating some of the reading that we've done in preparation for this. There's actually some good writing about this, teaching as improvisation. The first is sort of a fundamental contrast between scripted and improvisational teaching. By scripted teaching, I mean lecture, as opposed to open discussion. If you are preparing a lecture where you're talking the whole time that you're in the classroom, with no contributions from students, not even in the form of questions, that's, I think, what we have in mind when we talk about scripted. And you'll hear in a minute one of the archetypal versions of scripted, oddly enough, are TED Talks, where you're just watching the video, right? You're not responding, you're watching the video. Maybe the people who are being in the room are able to ask questions, but you're just watching. As opposed to open discussion. Scripted is a delivery of set knowledge in a structured performance where the teacher is a solo performer. Right? As opposed to open discussion where there's the construction of knowledge through the joint effort of teachers and students. Another sort of core concept is that improvisational teaching occurs using regular routines and structures that the teacher uses in an improvisational way. So you may have a brief 2-minute riff about the confidentiality as it relates to your placement, that you can deliver, but that you choose to wait to deliver until the right moment, until it comes up in class in a way. Right? Another idea is that learning is a creative, even an improvisational process. Engel was referring to this some earlier. The teacher and student construct learning together. The teacher's not delivering knowledge. The teacher's creating the occasion for joint construction of knowledge through a process of co-construction that includes both collaboration, and I'm looking at Susan Brooks when I say this next. I'm calling on you, Susan, I'm calling you out, and dialogue, right, which is part of Susan and Inga's chapter on communication and learning from practice. So learning is a creative and an improvisational process. These are sort of core concepts of this notion of teaching as improvisation. I have 2 slides on the elements of improv and teaching. This is the first one that's really in one article, and we'll give you the side studies in a little bit. Improv requires mastery of content. This is the notion that several of you were introducing.
I couldn't remember how to do a kazoo. I don't think I was improving very effectively because I have no mastery of content. It came back to me, but I was like, what am I doing here? Which end is that?
It's no accident that I started with the tin whistle. Right?
Yeah.
Because there was no mastery there, for me at least. So to respond to the unexpected, the teacher must have a more, and this is a quote, a more profound understanding of the material than if reciting a pre-planned lecture or script. You need to know your material so thoroughly that you can use it as appropriate for the situation that you're encountering. Right? Second, improvisation in a classroom requires skill in managing a group. Turn-taking, participant roles, distribution of turns, and other aspects of essentially facilitative process. This is a facilitative mindset, not a directive mindset. In a moment, Carrie's going to talk a little bit about an analogy to mediation. This is very much a facilitative mindset. And improv requires a willingness to accept the unexpected. If we are on a roll and we have a lecture and we want to get through the points that we want to cover in class, we may not have that willingness. We want to move on, right? As opposed to being ready to hear something different and rolling with it. And that willingness to accept the unexpected means active student participation, which in turn calls for active listening and a non-judgmental mindset. This is all from one of the articles by R. Keith Sawyer that we'll provide a citation to in a second. The second set of elements for teaching is improvisation. Improvisation in teaching means fostering interactive communication and dialogue, encouraging students to develop ideas and insights between them. The teacher delivers content, if at all, in brief, tailored units. Those short melodic riffs or those brief chord sequences that we all have prepared after years of teaching. We know them by heart. They're like on the back of our hand. But we learn to use them when the moment is right. There's a focus on structure and design as a framework. It's not just whatever the students bring, but the teacher has a certain amount of structuring to do. For improv, that should be improv to work. You need to plan out a structure within which improv will operate. For example, you might use advanced readings. Or start, as we did with this session, with a roadmap, right? Or use rounds methodology, which is a fairly structured approach, which contains multiple opportunities for improvisation within it. You rely on learned repertoires and short prepared statements. You learn to develop them and deliver them as appropriate to the needs of the discussion. And finally, and this is a point that I think it's worth stressing, you need to understand and work within the specific context. Some of the articles that we've read contrast improv in teaching to improv in theater, to improv in music, to improv in oratory. Assuming oratory is still a thing we do anymore. Right? I'm not sure we still do that at all. But the idea is that context matters. The purpose for which you're doing it matters. And the context in your classroom, the experiences that the students are having and bringing into the classroom matter. You need to be responsive to what the students have and what they can bring. Respect the context within which the students work. The quote is, creativity does not exist in a vacuum, but rather is response to specific, concrete, and hopefully relatively familiar contextual prompts. So Coltrane could do a lot of what he did in that video because the piano player was doing what he did and was familiar with it, right? And because the drummer was following up with related approaches. This is from an article by a group of people led by Carrie Holthus. Some of the outcomes that we would look for using improvisation in class: it engaged students in a collaborative process. They're working with each other and with you, sort of develop learning out of the situation. It fosters student autonomy through active participation. It prepares students for collaboration in a lot of different contexts, within law practices, with clients elsewhere, in communities. It models a flexible and situational use of prepared knowledge. When I thought that phrase out, I realized that sounds a lot like what most lawyers do most of the time, a flexible situational use of prepared knowledge. It models methods for dealing with difficult conversations. Right? And it models approaches to engaging in disagreement and conflict. Right? All of these are things, are potential outcomes of working improvisationally. All right. These are the sources that we've been talking about.
All of these will be on the website.
After the conference, we're going to link all the PowerPoints to the titles of the presentations on the website program so you'll be able to get them. All right. Russell.
I'd like to think about a couple aspects of improvisation I don't know, for outcomes, the process works to change the nature of the classroom, or it can. And it seems to me that at one end of that continuum of improvisation is like the TED Talk, the videotape, the YouTube talk that there is no interaction at all, there's no possibility for it, it's just a prepared speech, right? There's no interaction, there's no improv, it's a set piece. The lecture one step removed from that, the sort of typical law school lecture where you're asking some questions of students, still very much in control. Sometimes that goes well. It's a little bit of improv lecture. You're never sure what the student's going to say. It can lead places, and you start to have to at least respond to something that's not totally a set piece. But it's still on a sort of scale of control on one hand by the teacher, by the professor, and the other end of that continuum, whatever we want to call it, but it is not represented by control from the top down. It's a much more egalitarian sort of situation. Is the other end of that continuum. And so we have this lecture style at one end. There's a need to respond, and to be spontaneous to some extent, but I don't think it's really what we're talking about when we talk about improvisation as a methodology, as a pedagogy. Because at the other end, the power in that classroom where students are participating, the professor is at most facilitating, that's a really different feeling in there. And that's not something everybody gravitates toward. It's not something all law faculty gravitate toward, is giving up their power and giving up their control. It also seems like we can talk about this in terms of voice, right? And the inclusion of voices or the exclusion of voices. And it's quite deliberate. If you're doing a lecture, you don't want a whole lot of other voices. That's the whole point. In a discussion, on the other hand, you want to make the space as welcoming. You want to make the process one that people feel sufficiently included that they will talk, that they will engage. Okay? So it seems to me that one of the goals of improvisation is to change those kind of power dynamics within the law school classroom. You may or may not decide you like that, but it seems to me that that's one of the products of an improvisation. Now, I'll go backward. There. So if this is a continuum with the TED Talk on one end, discussion with no prearranged topic, and even no assigned material on the other end, it's just sort of a discussion, it almost reaches the point of anarchy. It can, and we're probably afraid of that. But there might be some utility to that as well. And I would suggest that at least you're in the bottom half of this continuum when you're actually doing improvisation. And it's clear to the students, it's transparent to the students that this is improvisation, at least to some degree, because they know that sends the message to them that they have some control over where this goes. And that's a game changer in that classroom. It seems to me it's really a technique that fits the externship seminar model, it fits the clinical model quite well, and is just something else to think about in this world of improvisation and what that might mean for us.
Yep, thanks. Because I only have one screen, so you can just
Put the whole thing up?
Well, yeah, actually. So when we actually, some of our planning calls were, I'm just trying to reset this instead. Were actually in a form of improv in a way. I mean, we just were exploring this topic, and before we even had finished all doing the reading, we were struggling, not really struggling, but coming up with some ideas to fit into wrapping our heads around the theory. And so we came up with a few, and we want to throw them out to you to, in addition to the conceptual framework, are any of these useful for you before we move on for the next step? So one is, going back to the music analogy, we were talking about, is it like music and is it like an orchestra? And one idea was, are we, when we are improvising, are we the conductor with the baton and just without preparation, just, no, let's hear from you and let's hear from you, which is very different than the jazz improv we saw, for sure. But then all of a sudden we said, well, could it be that really, if we're doing improv, that the music analogy might be, we're just another, not just, we are another musician in the room. We have a particular instrument, and we are choosing to play it when we feel we have to, rather than viewing on the end of the continuum where we are in charge and deciding who's going to play when. So that's another idea. And then picking up on what I think we all already talked about, in the jazz, what made it work was having pre-planned riffs and other melodic themes that come back in, which we can use as well. Another idea, and this was certainly where I started, not that I'm an expert at all, but I've worked with somebody who has teaching improv skills to her way of public speaking. The idea was thinking about improv theater. And so doing a little reading, one of the things I became aware of is how much of a core concept of improv and theater is the concept of yes and, where your idea is collaborative work. You have some common ideas to start with, and the yes and means you are not blocking or interfering, you're going with whatever comes up. So that might be a useful way to think about what are we doing in the classroom when we're improving. And I'm not even sure that's a verb. Improvisating is being an improvisator. I don't know, but improvising. Improvising, right. So the other was how, and Alex and I both have done mediation training and taking mediation training, etc., and served as mediators. I don't know how many of you have, but the extent to which it is, we really saw the analogies of if you are a facilitative mediator, where you know that your responsibility is to moving the structure along, creating the structure and moving the discussion along, as opposed to directing, evaluating, problem solving for the people, how similar it is and how just the feel of when you might want to weigh in and not. Ask a question or not. Make a statement, an observation. Choose to move the structure along. That may be a familiar place for you to say, hey, you know, I can do this. I already do this. And then finally, I think it was Russell who came up with the idea of, when we were talking about the continuum, it's knowing how to be small in a role that for so many of our colleagues is about being big and at the front. So it's very weird that we're spending so much time being big and in the front here. We're about to change that. But anyway, how much space are you taking up to really think about it and think about the why? Is this because I need to hear myself speak, or what is the reason? And being able to change your size and move it along depending on what you're doing and what's happening in the room. So these were some of the analogies we throw out there, if useful, as you think about what this really is and how we use it. But that is the end of our being big in the front. We think.
We think.
We think.
So quick write. Try to go ahead with this. Take a minute and just write down either what is your gut reaction to how these concepts relate to your teaching. What's your gut reaction to how they relate? Or one example of how you use improv, by plan or reactive. You take a minute. Carolyn. The exercise of teaching.
I didn't time that, so but it must be after.
I would say.
Okay. It's sort of a long minute, actually. What do you have? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why it's so hard to teach these classes, because the dream is to be able to be present and have that knowledge and all that experience just come out at the right time. So I just think this is what makes it so hard. It is truly like an art. You know, you want to make the music, but sometimes it can be challenging for a variety of reasons. But just being able to just be completely present and not thinking about the next 20 minutes of the class or what the students did before, I mean, that is so difficult, but it also makes it, I think, really fun to teach this type of a class.
Yeah. And, yeah. To the extent you can buy into the fact that if you're not going to know exactly what's going to happen next, it might help relax in that situation.
In the music analogy, I see myself as, if I were to do this, as the piano player, not John Coltrane. The students should be that, but I feel like my students would all be kazoo players. And what do I have the
That's
skills to
beginning
get
of
my
class or
kazoo
end?
players to do something productive?
The students expect you to be the kazoo player, or?
No, I said they are a bunch of kazoo players.
She wants John Coltrane and she gets kazoo, right?
Why do you think that they're, I mean, you may be right, why is?
No, the point of my gut reaction was just wondering if I have the skill to lead them or to get back on track if they go off playing the kazoo, whereas I was hoping for, what, that was the saxophone?
Yeah.
Saxophone.
I was kind of thinking about it slightly differently, and thinking about, you know, myself as a discussion facilitator, and so by asking a question, I'm inviting the group to pipe up. And so then, you know, they pipe up, respond to each other, and I only pipe in if they haven't made a point that I think is really important for them to get. But sort of, I see it more as an invitation to them to start talking, and then sort of try and fade out a little bit.
The interesting thing about that is that your description is accurate. You're inviting them to engage and to start up and to go as long as they can. At the same time as, and in addition to structuring what they do by the content of your question, the topic that you're asking. So you're providing a little bit of structure, like that melody that I went out with, and then they just run with it.
Well, to that point, going off the structure aspect, I think it's interesting because you're learning alongside them in some ways, because even if you provide the assignments and the reading and sort of the structure of the program, and it's similar each semester, the content entirely changes based on the students and where they're at and the discussion, and so you can have a similar framework, but it's completely changed each time you apply it, and I think that makes it exciting for you as a facilitator as well.
I found this very helpful to me, partly because I think that just building up what's already been said, is that it always feels like this should be an easy class to teach. I've done it before, I know what's going on, I've seen all sorts of things come up in the past, and yet it always feels hard. And now I see, this helps me understand that doing improvisation really is harder than just a lecture. So I appreciate that.
Right, and the thing to notice about that, Nancy, is that the doing it before, seeing a lot of different things, seeing this material play out in different ways, what you're building there is a series of, if you don't mind my being a little too nerdy, cognitive patterns, right? Ways of recognizing what's coming from a particular group of people that suggest several different choices about what you might do to move this in a slightly different way.
I think you're building your expertise, right?
Right, and I appreciate knowing that what seems like this should be easy actually is hard, so it's okay that I feel that it's.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm very, just in my second year, and I was just having a conversation after the last workshop about how difficult all this is, and I appreciated all the analogies, and I think the one, well, I sort of resonated with all of them, but the one about being small is, sort of plays into my anxiety or lack of confidence right now as a new clinician But I would say that where it kind of goes to is, how do I know that making myself small, which I feel like I'm doing partially because I'm not sure exactly how to interject, but that aside, I worry that the conversation as it flows along and has been great is not meaningful. And I just don't know, like, as you make yourself small, you know, I want to feel like the students are walking away because their professors are so big, and who do they, you know, that there's this sense in a way that if you're not actually saying something really important, is it really meaningful, and will they appreciate its meaning? And
It is very hard to give up power to people who want you to have it.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, that in part, I mean, they're in their 19th year of school or something like that. You know,
Well, and
some
my
more than
students have
that.
said
They
to
are
me, no.
experts at sitting in class and listening to teachers and figure out how to get a good grade.
And my students have said no one's asked them to do this before. They don't know how to do it either. So they're very much wanting you to sort of take control, and
Yeah.
they don't know how to do it.
I had a conversation with my dean not too recently. He usually has regular lunches, public opinion baths with students. And he told me about a student who started complaining about teachers who don't teach anything. Teachers who don't say anything in class, they don't teach anything. He used my class as an example. Right? And I knew exactly what he was talking about. I knew this was a student who was frustrated with the amount of time I spent asking them what they thought, asking them to sort of assess and appraise their experience or listen to other people. I wasn't delivering, I was being quiet, being small. And what the student wouldn't notice, and I wouldn't expect him necessarily to notice, is the structure that I'm providing through the questions that I'm asking and what content I choose to deliver in short snippets.
Does your dean appreciate that?
No, but it's okay. He has other reasons to like me.
He heard us clap.
Right. I think this phenomenon of students sort of having these expectations, that's something else that we need to be able to deal with, and letting them know this is different, this class is different, this approach is different, so that we're more transparent about it, and at least they understand that it's intentional. And that it's an intentional attempt to shift the responsibility to them, to shift the sort of the authority to them. If they're not accustomed to, this may feel funny, but you'll be okay, really. That's
I think the orchestra example might cause us, or the orchestra analogy might cause us to miss things. So if we expect something, if we go in expecting a particular thing, and with orchestra, different from a jazz session where I think what happens, I'm not really a musician, but I think what happens with jazz musicians is they're all really listening to each other, and what they're expecting is to create something great. They may not have this idea of what great looks like, but they believe that it's going to be great, so they're really working together to make it happen. And I think what happens with me sometimes when I'm preparing, I have my questions that I'm going through, discussion questions, and then I spend some time thinking about what are the possible answers that students might give, and then what I really want them to get out of it. And so I ask a question, and then I start listening for what I think I expected them to say and what I want to deliver. And then I'm missing out on what they're actually saying, which is what they really care about. And if they were really, and if I were paying attention, then what I could do better is connect things up for them and really get much more, so going back a little bit to the being small, rather than me saying, this is what I want you to get out of it, just really paying attention to what they need to get out of it and what they already are getting out of it very much.
One particular skill that I know that many of you will have heard about, it's certainly a staple of mediation training, is the process of active or reflective listening, where when someone says something, particularly if it catches you by surprise, it's sort of off angle from what you were thinking they might say or where you might want them to go, you repeat it back. Yeah, so what I hear you saying is this, and I have found that not only does that make sure the student knows I heard them, but it makes sure I know that I heard them and that I can check what I heard. And it also allows me to conceptualize it a little bit so I can start thinking about, well, how does that relate to the plans, the next steps that I want to engage in? We have a couple different things, so yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to do a time check.
Like 3 or 4 more comments? All right.
I was just gonna say another tool that I've used in addition to active listening is curiosity. So this was very nerve-wracking for me, like moving from that control to a more improvisational place, but one of the things you can always fall back on and rely on is your actual curiosity, right? Because your students, if you keep engaging them and asking them questions, will tell you, I mean, most of us know what we want to say and what we need to learn anyway. It's just where the tools for facilitating that. And so you do that by just remaining really curious and remaining really present. So that's a tool you can fall back on in addition to active listening.
Chrissy and then Susan.
This all resonates with me deeply, and I would say I'm a feeling girl. So I'm very much about the energy in the room, and I think Coltrane would probably say the same thing. You just kind of feel the music. And so the first thing I do, like first class, is this class is going to feel different. And then there's a great visual out there where instead of the lecture format of a scholar on the stage, where there's now this collective format, and that visual has worked. But then I ask every class, how we feeling, what we doing, what we want to talk about. Let's just start with that. And I have no idea where it's going to go, but those are the best classes. I hate hearing myself talk sometimes because that energy just falls flat.
Best and most terrifying.
Yeah, I'm nervous every time.
Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to offer up that many of you have either seen this on your own or maybe you've seen me show it, but I show all of my classes, including my family law class, this visual depiction of the brain, the right and left brain. And, and so it's a way of trying to emphasize to them that, like, to actually explain, okay, well, because what it shows is like I'm going to get this wrong, the one that's creative, right? That's the right brain.
Right.
It's the right brain.
So anyway, but it shows the side, one side is like black and white squiggles, and it says, I'm analytical, I'm linear, I'm all this, and then the other one is like bright, vibrant colors, and it goes outside the lines, and I basically say, okay, well, it may be that up until now in law school, this is what has been valued. I want you to know in this class, this is also valued, and in fact, I think to be an effective lawyer, you need to bring, your whole self into the work, including your creativity, including your ability to make connections and integrate things. And so I sort of like talk about that very explicitly and say, this is really, through a visual tool for trying to bring that across to them, that this is going to be valued. The other thing I'm sharing, and maybe it's sort of what Chris was saying, with all of the classes that I've done where the students are in field experiences, I always have a portion of the class that is just a check-in. And that can be, and one of the things with that, and actually one of my colleagues has helped me with this, and it's constant work, is when you open things up for a check-in, you may not get hands right away, or you might get the same hands, and to just be able to sit with it a little bit, and then invariably more people, probably a more diverse group of people, will raise their hands and make contributions, but it could be, the prompt would just be, anything you want to share from your experience this week, anything that went really well, anything that was surprising to you, and those stories can be just tremendously rich. But then I think you have to then, which I also struggle with a little bit, is if I have a whole other set of things I want to do, not rushing through, or if there's another, like really taking the time with it and to kind of make that more of a focus if that needs more focus. So that's trade-offs.
Great. Thank you all. Wonderful. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
So
We're not done yet. I'm thanking you for the stuff so far.
So we're going to condense this a little bit. Right, you want to do the, what is?
I'll move the slide.
Yeah, that would be great. So what we thought we would do is actually do a little improv, and I need to recruit some people. What the plan would be, that Alex is the teacher, Russell and a few of you are going to be students in a class. It is a mixed externship placement class. We'll need to figure out for a few of you, maybe like 4 of you, what kind of externship you are, so we get some people up to be Russell's classmates, and the assignment was the navigating cultural difference material. And we're going to do a longer, but maybe we'll do a 10-minute class and see what happens, but here was the thought, and I still think this is worth it. I put some questions on the board. If you can't read them, I'll read them right now. We're going to say, what do you notice regarding structure and the improv? And or is the improvisation with the process or the substance or both? And what other choices does the teacher have? And I would ask, so I was going to ask a few of you to be willing to stand up here and take your notes here that none of us can see, and then periodically you'd be the Greek chorus, right? I would be moderating. I might ask you, what do you see here? So is anybody willing to, are you willing to improv with us, first of all? And if so, I need 4 people who will populate the class. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so come on down. And while you're thinking about what kind of externship, Russell is at a public defender office, and we want to mix it up. Are there people who would like to be more public with their thoughts on what they're observing? Because I think we're going to jettison that part, right?
Okay, good.
We're good, because we're losing some time. I will ask you to think about these, and I may stop, therefore, and you're all the Greek chorus, and just say, who saw what here? So I'm in charge of when we're going to interrupt and see what's going on. The idea was I would see that, but we're going to even improv even more, because I wouldn't even know what the hell you're thinking. Like, we're not, right? All right, so.
Do you want to review the questions?
Yes, so what did you notice? It could be anything else, but we'd like you to at least start with what did you notice regarding the structure that the teacher is delivering and the improv. So based on the theory, are you observing anything in action? Is it process, substance, or both? And what other choices does the teacher have? And we would also, when we were talking about it, you could also be thinking, you would be thinking if you were the teacher, oh shit. Or whatever else, like whatever, if you put yourself in the role here of Alex. Now, before we start, let's see who's in this class. We know Russell's in the public defender class. Kim, where?
I'm at the Animal Legal Defense Fund.
Animal Legal Defense Fund.
I'm with an immigration advocacy organization.
Immigration. Now, I would like to mix it up. So where are you guys?
Legal aid.
No, it's too close.
Can I do the government? I'll do government.
Yeah, government. Which office?
HUD.
Okay, government, your legal aid, your animal, your public defender. Would you be corporate?
Yes, I'm general counsel at a large hospital organization.
Great. So, everybody got that, Alex? You would know your class, so we have Carol, Nancy, Allison, Russell, and Kim. You got that? You know where they are?
More or less.
More or less? Okay. We're going to do this for, what do you say? Because we want to discuss it too.
You're in control.
Oh, yeah. We'll do it for as long as.
You say when we're ready.
No, we'll see. We'll see. But I'm going to stop at a couple points and just ask for some comments, and then we'll let them start again, and we'll do this for a little while, and then bring it in. We'll stop it at some point.
All right, good to see you all again. It's been a week. It's been a week since I've seen you last. The assignment for this week was the chapter on navigating cultural difference from learning from practice. Right?
Can everybody hear?
Am I talking loud enough?
A little louder.
The chapter from this week was learning from practice, or from learning from practice on navigating cultural difference. And if you remember, I asked you to consider 2 questions as you read the chapter and as you went through the week. The first question was, come here with an example of cultural difference that you've observed at some point in your legal career, your career either before law school or during law school. Could be anything. And not necessarily a replacement. The second question is an example of cultural difference you've observed within the legal profession. There are actually differences in legal cultures between lawyers of different kinds. So I asked you to think about that and see if you could come back with an example. So I want to turn to those questions to start and open it up. Does anyone have examples of cultural difference that they've observed anywhere in their life as a law student, as someone come into the law, or within the legal profession?
Well, I've observed a very stark economic difference from what I'm used to, what I grew up with, and my clients that I'm representing, and I'm having a hard time relating to just the examples of the conditions they're living in. I went on a housing inspection, and the place was so disgusting that I couldn't imagine anybody living there. Just not just that it was that the family didn't have much income, but it was messy, and there was animals and smelled bad and moldy. Clearly a dog had defecated in the corner, and I was pretty shocked. So I don't know that that's what that comes from, but I felt that that was beyond my experience. It was very
Well, thank you. What I want to do is see if we've done this before in class. I want to sort of use a small version of what we've called rounds before this. Right? Nancy's introduced a story that we could explore. What I want to do is see if any of you have questions about the sort of information that Nancy has, more information you'd like to understand what she observed more completely. After that, we'll talk about the context of the problem. We're going to talk about different ways of addressing it. And then we may, if we have time, get to some evaluation. But let's start with questions that anyone has about the story that Nancy's doing.
What were the circumstances in which you were visiting that?
well, they were going to be, the clients were going to be addicted from this really horrible place to live, which may end up being a good thing for them, but they didn't want to leave. And they had complained about the conditions of the house, but it seemed to me that they contributed to the deterioration of the house just by how unkept it was.
So I don't understand why that was surprising to you. I mean, they were not from White Plains. I mean, what would you expect?
I guess I was expecting that there wouldn't be piles of poop in the corner of the room.
Other questions about other information, and that's a question about Nancy's reaction, which is clearly information important. Other questions about that you need to know about just the story itself.
What did you know about the family and their circumstances?
I knew very little about the family. So, and I do have questions about it. I'm feeling like it might be more than just a housing issue, that maybe the mom has some mental health issues going on. There may be some other disabilities in the family, and that might be contributing to it, but I haven't found any of that out.
Did you actually see any of the animals, and was there something that you were thinking about with respect to the animals' treatment, other than the fact that they were medicated?
No, there was kind of I think I heard a dog in one of the rooms behind a closed door, and there was a couple of cats running around, but no, the animals that I saw did not seem distressed, not that I would believe, no.
These are your clients?
Yeah, it was the clients are the ones who are living in the house.
And are they facing eviction?
That's what prompted the visit, and I went with one of the other attorneys, because they don't send us in alone, who has seen some, we talked about it a little bit, and the attorney's seen some bad conditions as well, but even he was surprised.
So let's take a time out for a second. And first of all, what sort of, anything you want to say, but my thoughts would be what kind of, what are you seeing Alex doing? Are there other things? Do you have questions for Alex about why he's doing what he's doing? Observations and or questions for Alex?
I have a question. So you went straight to asking about their observation and not to their understanding of what cultural difference means, or opening up a shared dialogue about their own culture? And I'm just wondering, what's the better method? Like,
So there's a thought behind that. It may be the wrong thought, but there's a, as I'm fond of saying, I might be wrong about this, but I'm thoughtfully wrong. Right? You know, what I heard in the situation was a strong set of value judgments from Nancy about the circumstances that she's observing. That judgments that she may not be fully conscious she's making, or that she might not see as judgments. They may just be facts.
Yeah, and I'm more
From
likely
her point of view.
conclusions.
So what I'm doing is slowing what I think I'm doing, and I'd be curious if this is coming across, is slowing the conversation down, starting out with information first, and then the next phase will be context, sort of what are the different contexts that help you understand the story, cultural, otherwise. So I'm anticipating a longer discussion at this point.
but Alice, you started it with asking about the observation in the field.
Yep.
What about asking about their own personal introspectiveness of the culture, of what they think their culture is first, so that you can see if there's an association, or that there's some ways to guide through that concept, that they may not even have the context. They may have done the reading, but they may not have the context. I don't know if that's...
Some of this has to do with my own approach and style. My own assumption is that a student's not going to be ready to get there fast. That involves a level of personal disclosure that may take some time to get to in this discussion. If I knew these students better, I might know that they're ready for that. This might be a discussion that's happening in week 10 as opposed to week 2. But with essentially an unfamiliar group of students, I might wait to get to that level of self-disclosure because of the discomfort that might come from it and the risk of a negative response. I'm sort of angling towards that, but I'm not going to ask it explicitly.
So why don't we ask each of the students just very briefly how they're feeling about what's happening, because we had a little anger. Is anybody uncomfortable? Just, Kim, how are you feeling about
Really
the
worried
class?
about the animals.
So you weren't clearly. You knew that we were going there. So she wants to know, Russell, you pretty forcefully expounded. Where's the Russell student thinking? What's he thinking and how's he feeling?
It's just an affluent, law student who can't handle somebody who doesn't have the means to live the same life as she.
So you're coming, you heard her judgment. Allison, where are you?
I'm kind of thinking, well, what does the client want here? Because we're talking about they're being evicted, but they're also, she's talking about maybe they're contributing and okay living there, so I'm confused
And maybe
about
it's
what
even
the
better
client
for them,
wants.
right? Carol, then we'll go to Nancy.
I'm worried about holistic mental health issues within the family. And also sometimes when people get evicted, they just start a place right before. So maybe that's part of it.
And Nancy, how is the Nancy character feeling?
I'm still feeling bewildered and I don't know what to think about this family or what I'm supposed to do with this situation as the lawyer of this family.
Okay, so I know I cut you off, Esther. Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Yes, actually, in response to the comment about asking what Alex was thinking when he asked how he's dealing with this, and I actually thought that was a great both process and substance improv, because I think the question you asked actually was, what was your experience with cultural differences? And she came back with her reaction to the situation. So turning that back to the students, I thought was both of those things, improv on substance and process.
So do you want, I know, yeah. No, do you want to, I know we're running behind and we agreed we were going to go a few minutes over. Do you want to show us where you would go next after this bizarrely interruptive distraction? What would you do next? And of course now we've given you a little more insight into where your students are. What would you do next? And then we'll go for another minute or two and then stop and get more comments.
Shall I do it?
I think you should do it.
All right, good. So let's assume we may have other questions about the story that Nancy related. I want to turn to a different part of the discussion. Right? I want to talk about it now is what assumptions are underlying how, well, in your case, how you reacted to the clients. And for the rest of you, how you heard Nancy's story and what you understand, how you evaluate the story. Because there's a lot of value judgments, at least potential in this situation. So let me ask that question. What assumptions do you hold that affected the way you heard Nancy's story and Nancy, the way you experienced this situation?
So we were in court the other day, and then we went to the probation office. Can I tell you about this?
Sure.
We were in court the other day, went to the probation office, and we didn't have our client with us. It was Kate as our supervisor, and Juan and I, and the probation officers looked up and said hello, and then looked at Juan and said, are you the defendant? And I just went in, and he just sort of wilted there, and we walked out after that. And Kate didn't say anything at all, and I wasn't sure how to approach it.
So there's something about Nancy's story that prompted you to tell that story. What was it? Why is that story?
I thought it was a really good story.
So not necessarily related to what Nancy's talking about at all.
Well, you asked about sort of the underlying assumptions, and they talk about assumptions. There was an assumption there that just was overwhelming.
And how would you,
it left a lot on the table.
How would you describe the assumptions in that story?
Racist.
Racist. Okay. That suggests that if we hold certain attitudes towards particular groups of people, it's going to affect the way we treat them. Am I hearing that correctly?
Seems right to me.
So is Russell suggesting that my reaction to my clients is racist?
Is that what you're hearing?
A little bit.
We haven't actually talked about the color of your clients, the race of your clients. Was that a factor for you in how you reacted?
No, as far as I could tell, just from having met them, they were not a family of color. They were Caucasian, although making that assumption that they were.
One of the things in the chapter that we will get to talk about in the second hour class is this idea of intersectionality, this notion that we all are composed of multiple different identities, our race, our gender, our class, our education, and that in any given situation we may both have different identities that people were working with, but also overlapping identities. So in this situation, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to observe that you're Caucasian, right? And so you're working with a Caucasian family. That wasn't as much of an influence for you. What assumptions did you have that affected the way you saw these clients and you reacted to them?
That's a hard question to answer. I thought that I was going into the house site visit with an open mind, but I immediately felt like nobody was this way.
So you wanted to go in with an open mind?
Yes. I read the chapter beforehand, and I'm trying not to make any assumptions, but I was still surprised.
So you might have felt like you ought to have gone in with an open mind, but you had a strong reaction.
I did.
All right. How about others? What other assumptions did other people have in reacting to Nancy's story? Yeah.
I think that a lot of people don't understand that being poor isn't a personal choice, and that being poor is really hard. And I think that we have to be careful about that.
Which suggests sort of thinking through what might have caused the house to be in the condition that it's in. Right? It may well be that there's some blame to be allocated here. I kind of heard you suggesting they should have or could have done something differently. But there may be other explanations going on. Is that, am I hearing you right?
All right, so in the interest of time, we're going to call it. And can I just, how are the 5 students feeling right now? Nancy, are you still feeling backed in the corner, or are you feeling heard a little bit, or what?
I think that I'm starting to feel heard. I went from feeling backed into a corner to feel better, and I'm now my brain is starting to work out what are some of the other reasons why the house was in the condition that it was.
Okay, any other reactions?
If I'm in my strong not him, but the animal person, I'm starting to feel this is from this. Because the person from the Animal Legal Defense Fund is like wanting to protect animals, but not really in the poverty world. So I'm starting to feel like this is a conversation that I'm feeling distance from. In that world, not me, Tim.
Which may mean that I need to be alert to that and come back and ask you about the concern you expressed earlier.
Right, and Russell, with your interjection, how are you feeling now? Did you feel he paid enough attention to you, not enough?
He never wants to listen to me.
Great. All right, so a
Still in low,
couple more observations as that went on any of the topics.
I thought Alex did a great job of the yes and. So there was one where they said something and you said yes, and that has to do with intersectionality so he was using the reading and not just reflecting what they said, but then adding to it.
Yeah, Margaret.
Just one observation is the way Alex brought the rest of the group into it and then went back to Nancy to kind of test to see how she was feeling and what she was doing. Can I ask the question I was going to ask? It sort of goes back to the first part of it, but it ties in. I was just curious, like, I feel like if Russell had made that comment, the first comment, then I might have asked him at that point, and I'm sort of asking the group, but in that improv world, if he had made that comment, I'm wondering whether I might have said, well, from your placement experience or personal experiences, can you tell me more that might lead you to make that comment to sort of get, because I think you want to diffuse that situation because it was somewhat judgmental in his comment, but by the same token, I feel like it needs to maybe be addressed to try to, why are you being so judgmental here? There might be some insights, but you don't want it to blow up. So I was just kind of curious if others would have picked up on that more when you made that comment.
Would anybody have done something different with Russell's comment?
The first comment.
The first one,
the first
earlier.
comment about, well, I don't know why he was surprised. I mean,
Right.
I felt like he handled it well because he just made a process comment, which was your response is evaluative, and we're not at that place right now. Right now, we're still in the, questioning phase. So we sort of, by using a process comment, didn't evaluate his comment.
Right,
And moved it back to where it needed to go.
So use that tool, yes.
And by being patient, he was able to really draw out the root of where that was coming from, because I felt like his experience with Juan was really feeding his aggressive sort of comment.
And he was bursting with that, right? And so eventually just burst forward. Yes. Great.
So,
Yeah.
the one thing is I think the question for me would be, is it week 2 or week 10? Because I would handle that very differently in week 10 than I would in week 2.
I also felt like Russell wanted to have a conversation about this situation and racism in the system, and that I kind of co-opted the conversation, and maybe we're not going to get to discuss that important issue.
Well, the interesting thing, and if I can speak from my perspective for a second, I experienced Russell's 2 interjections, right, as moving me off track. I mean, I understand you feel like you co-opted the session, but I actually made a choice to focus on your story, and to focus on it in some depth and detail and at some length, right? Using it as a focus of a rounds process that could potentially take the whole class. The risk of doing that is that people with strong stories to tell are not going to feel hurt, to use Russell's
And the animal
phrase.
rights person is left out.
And the animal, right, exactly. So
is that because I talked first that we're on my subject?
Well, and is it fair to say, Alex, did that fit into your agenda somewhat of what you wanted to do with the chapter? Getting back to is it what you want to do or what they want to do? Were you more just listening to see what came up, or were you aware of it being sort of where you were hoping to go?
So I made a choice right after Nancy spoke to do something that basically affected everything else that happened, to focus in on her story. I could have made another choice. As soon as Nancy told her story, I could say, thank you, that's a helpful story. We may come back to it. Does anyone else have something else,
Right.
some other story they want to tell?
So getting back to what other things could the teacher do, that would have been going a very different route, yeah.
I'm wondering if there was a common thread in there. I heard Russell expressing some frustration on his part by not quite knowing how to handle the situation in the story that he was telling. And I'm wondering if there isn't a point in here of okay, how would each of you now, being some distance away from that, think about handling it now? We frequently come up with solutions after we've been through something and wish, damn, I wish I'd done that then.
Right, right. Well, I am aware that we're over time, and we did want to give thank you to the class, first of all. And just however, we expect to take another couple minutes of just what takeaways do you want, are you, let's put a little bit of a closure on this. Do you have some particular, we heard some of them before, thank you, this is hard. We heard some of that. Are there other things, and this would be takeaway from the whole thing, as well as the demo, any other things you're
A little bit of just a quick question, but in like what you've read preparing for this, a lot of it seems to rely on like experience, like being in the situation. You're so calm and cool. I'm like, I want part of that. But are there any techniques for sort of like getting there faster? You know what I mean? Like getting to that other than just, especially with this kind of scenario. I mean, like, I was just thinking, you know, as soon as you spoke up, I would have been like, my internal, like, like, oh shit!
That's right.
Stay present. So I would accelerate.
So my answer to that question is yes and no.
Yeah.
An entirely useless question answer. The yes part is, yes, there are many techniques, you know, the active listening, the curiosity that Inga mentioned earlier, the art of reframing and paraphrase, sort of coming in with a solid sense of what structures you can use, right? That's the yes part. A lot of these are mediative techniques, so you know, take a mediation training. Even if you never are a mediator, can be really, really helpful. The no part has to do with that concept that we discussed, that I think we mentioned earlier. Over time, you will build a series of patterns in your mind, and the ability to recognize certain situations when you arise. That's the part. And then use those past experiences to inform the choices that you make in the present. Right? That's the part that takes time.
Mark, you ready?
I teach Civ Pro, and I also, you know, have an internship setting as well. And you actually explained something to me that I grapple with all the time, and that is the different roles you play involved in teaching those things. And one of the difficulties is that I have students that I had in civil procedure that I'm now supervising in the internship program. They saw me teaching one way, and they're expecting me to teach the same way in a small group. And we have to spend some time on basically saying, you know, this is a whole different thing, the whole purpose of this is different. And it brings me back to sort of a problem I had when I first started teaching in an externship program, having been an in-house clinician before. And that was, people would ask me, what are you teaching? And I scratched my head and said, I don't know. You know, what am I teaching? And it actually pained me for a while until I realized that's the wrong question. And answer it essentially helping students find their professional identity. Not that that satisfied people, but at least there was a response.
Other takeaways. Let's see, I mean, in the interest of getting you out, we had a bunch of takeaways that we want to make sure we discuss. First, we want to suggest that this is not unusual. This is not specialized. This is not advanced. Right? Improvisation is familiar. It occurs all the time, either in small-scale reactions to unexpected contributions or by playing for an entire class. You know, I imagine Chris's class would be, so let's check in. What's going on? Could not be a more open-ended question where you just can't know what's going on. Second, improvisation is not seat of the pants. Right? It relies on prepared content delivered at the right time. It relies on structuring the opportunities for reflection. And I think I threw in at least 4 different ways of structuring the discussion that we just observed. Improvisation requires discipline from the teacher, to be patient, with the unexpected. I mean, the other part of my no answer is patience is a learned ability, but it takes some time to learn it, right? And to hear and to respond to what students bring. That's I think in the same general family as this notion of curiosity introduced. And finally, improvisation means collaboration with students. And that's it.
My takeaways, I'm going to use the kazoos and the Coltrane with my class to talk about.
So there are a few older tin whistles and some, anybody who has a kazoo may keep it
Yes.
to practice on, so you're better. Right?